Welcome to another CBA Level 3 Grille coaching session. And this session follows along from the center collar material bottom tooling session. There are a number of ways to achieve a center collar. You can get a wrapped collar. Let me show you. You can pick up a laser pointer here. We've got the wrapped collar in the right here. We've got the forged collar, not a subject to this lesson or coaching session. And then we have the pin collar. So I'm going to cover the pin collar and the wrapped collar. Let's talk practicalities before we start. You've got a number of moving parts here. You've got the center style, you've got the corner material holding the square corners and the leaf work, and then you've got the beveled scroll material. I would pin those all together. I've shown a drill hole pinned by a rivet, but these days you'd be equally okay just grinding a groove in there and filling it full of MIG. Whatever is your poison. But if you do fill it full of MIG, don't get it too proud because you run the risk of skipping with your grinder and making some grinder marks up here, which would not be acceptable. I'm going to look at the wrapped collar first. And regardless as to the style of bead that you use, thin or wide, you're going to have to make some tooling to protect the bead as you're turning this in your whatever tooling you're going to make. And you need to make something that's going to keep the whole thing stable while you're turning in the ends of the collar. Let's have a look at my tooling. And the tooling can range from what might be seen as excessive to simple. I said this is mine, and it's designed to be used at the vise. It's got a staple welded to the side, which is going to keep the two vise inserts open, and that helps me. And you're looking at about a 2 by 2 by 3/8, I believe, angle iron. Let's have a look at the different elements within this. Firstly, let's have a look at bending the collar material to make a U shape, and I'm going to do that over here. I've got two vertical bars, and they are set just wider than my bead, and they are wider than the surface of the back strap, so I'm not leaving any ding marks when I'm bending. Excuse me. And then if I have a look at a piece of collar material, so I want those two bars to be wider than this. And then equally as important, when I look at the bead material here, is the transition to the bead. I want those to have soft edges. So my vertical bars and my jig have got soft edges to protect those transition points. And in these pictures, I'm showing my first bend of the collaring stock. There are a couple of things to note here. First, it's a center punch mark on the edge of the collar material, and that suggests that there's going to be some form of math later on, and yes, you're right. And secondly, is that I have relieved the edge of the angle line to match the chamfered edges on your scroll work, and that's going to help with the fit of the collar later. So back to the first point, which is measurement. At some stage, you're going to have to cut the collar from the collar material, so you need to know where to cut. There are multiple formulas out there to help you determine the length of collar material needed per type of collar used, whether you're doing the wrap, the forged, assembled, whatever it is. And all of the formulas are correct, but they don't transfer from one method to another. So it's pick your poison and stay with it. I would encourage you to do some test pieces before you attempt to wrap anything around your hard worked for grill, just so there's no gnashing of teeth later on. The typical place to start for the wrap collar is adding the perimeter of the material to be collared to twice the thickness of the collaring stock. Some say 2.5, twice works for me. And that might seem easy enough, but there's a couple of other factors to take into account. First, the perimeter of the material to be collared. As these are scrolls, you're going to notice that I've got some air gaps here. And this, my rule is 1 inch, the same width as my collar. So you can see I have to factor those air gaps in when I'm taking my measurement. So my measurement goes across here, not just a sum and total of every bar that's involved. Got to include the air gaps. And then I've got to work out my collar stock. They said twice the thickness. Well, what's the thickness? Is it the thickness of the back strap? Is it the thickness of the back strap plus the bead material? The bead material looks fairly insignificant in there. I'm not quite sure what I'm trying to achieve. So for me, this is what I do. I take the bead and I say that's about 1/3 of the width of the collar material. And so I cut this into thirds. It's 1/4 of an inch tall, so 1/3 of that is about 1/16 of an inch. And then I add that to the thickness of my back strap, which is 1/4 of an inch, to get an average of 5/16. Excuse me. And do I care if I'm wrong? No, I don't, because I'm going to do a test piece first. So I don't care if my measurements are off. I just don't want to be miles away. This is where a fabricated collar starts to make sense, because then it's just measure, cut and file, and you get these quite nice sharp corners. So let's have a look at the math that we need. So I have the center stile, pick up a laser point here. I've got a center stile of 3/8 of an inch bar, no problems there. I've got 3/8 of an inch coming from my square corner. In my world, I actually don't. I put a taper on there to 5/16, but as per drawing, 3/8 of an inch for the square corner bar on the other side of the center stile, 1/4 inch for my beveled scroll, 1/4 inch for my beveled scroll, and I'm calling the gaps, the sum and total of the gaps, 1/8 of an inch. That might be a little heavy. So I'm going to call that 1 3/4 inches per side. The thickness is a standard 3/4 of an inch all the way through. So I've got the front material of the material to be collared, the back material, one side, second side, and I get that to equal a grand total of 5 inches. And then I need to work out twice the collar thickness. I said my average collar thickness was 5/16 of an inch. I'm going to multiply that by 2 to get 5/8 of an inch. Adding that together, I've got the perimeter of the stock to be collared plus twice the thickness of my collaring material, and I get that to be 5 5/8 of an inch. In reality, 5 9/16 worked for me. 5 5/8 was just a little heavy. So let's go back to our wrap collar. From my first experiment, I found that I was 1/16 of an inch too long, and you can see why in a little while. So my final length for me is 5 9/16, 5.5 if you want to be on the safe side, and you're going to end up with a very slight gap when you're finished, and that's going to work for me. We can close that a little bit. As I've made a special set hammer which accommodates the bead, and you can see that here. Here's my set hammer, and this is to accommodate the bead. I can stretch the collar material. I can take the set hammer, just place it on here, and I can just squeeze out that and close. You can see I've got my little gap here. I can just close the top surface of my collar. Not going to get down to the root, but I just need the visual surface closed. So if I'm a little short of material, I'm talking a little, not a lot, then I can close it. So I've got my 5 9/16 or 5.5 inches of collaring stock. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to find center, and then I'm going to measure out half of the width of the stock to be collared. It was 1 3/4 we said. So half of that is 7/8. I'm going to add to that half the thickness, so the neutral axis of my collar, which should be 5/32, I suppose, in theory. As that's half the 5/16 supposed thickness. I can make another mark, and you can see that my second mark here is not where it should be. It should be somewhere out here on the 15/16 mark. So I am a little tight, and this is where me shrinking my measurement starts to come into effect. I like to crowd my corners so they fit nicely when I'm fitting the collar to the grill. And so in crowding those corners, I get a little stretch on my collaring material. This is my collaring jig, and I've got, as you can see here, a little gap between the two sides of the collaring jig. When I get to this stage, when I have bent a U shape of my collar, I've got these blocks, and this photograph shows them a little tight. I actually have them a little removed. So then I come in with my mandrel. I would advocate a mandrel first as a test piece, or I come in with my Grille if you need to. If this distance, because I've crowded my corners, if this distance is too tight, it's going to splay this material out to the side. Not a big factor, because these legs go out, they're splayed to the side, I can just nip up the vise, and then these blocks are going to close the splayed material, and I'm going to get a more precision fit, and it's going to help that corner get a better purchase on my material to be collared. So that's why I like to crowd the corners and fit the corner. You can see here that my center punch mark is a little above the jig. It's about half the thickness of the back strap above the jig, and I'm showing the use of a set hammer to make my first bend, but a hide mallet or a wooden mallet would work equally as well. In fact, my method of choice is to use a hide mallet, actually a combo hide and copper mallet. So let's have a look at that. This is a hammer by Thor company, and you can see it's got a hide surface, it's got a copper surface, and you're going to get those 35 to 45 depending on the weight you get. The size 1 is 1 1/4 inch, I think, a little light for my use. Size 3 is 1 3/4 inch, I believe, a little big. That makes the size 2 the obvious choice. So I'm showing my set hammer here to do this, but I make the bend and then I'm going to crisp up the corners. So if the material is slightly twisted, it's going one way or the other. Generally that means I've got a little piece of air under here, and I need to get rid of that to straighten the collar out. So I take my set hammer, close that, hit it, closing that piece of air down, and that's going to move the collar material the other way. So to do that and to protect that transition between the back strap and the bead material, remember I've got a soft transition here, you can see I've got a nice soft transition on either side of my set hammer. You can do a hand tool variation if you don't want to make a set hammer. This is something I use when I do the forged collar to create these nice corners here. And this particular one was made from a 7.5 inch length of 3/4 inch round 4140. But I digress. Let's get back to the collar. My vice jaws are quite large or quite deep. Not just the jaws, but the neck of the jaws. So it exceeds the width of the collar material that I would like to be collared. So my staple is not going to fit inside of my jaws. I have to work on the outside of the jaws of my vice. So I extend the jig out to the edge, and you can see I've cut away everything I don't need, leaving me with the width of the collar material, which was 1 3/4 inch, I believe we said. And don't forget, I've relieved the corners here to match the scroll work of those beveled scrolls, so no surprises there. And then I have a little kiss block that I've got set up the same height as this, so that I can just put the material in here, and then everything is going to fit. Working off the edge of the vise does create some problems, and so for me I have some welded tabs onto my jig that fit under the jaws of the vise and stop the jig from bobbling around. But then you become very vice centric. You can only use the one vise. So I've made my first bend. All I do now is I've got the heat here in my second bend. I fit it to my jig. I lift it up until the piece kisses my block, and then I make the second bend. And I want you to notice here that my center punch mark is about half the thickness of the back strap above the jig material, and that's right. So this is where it starts to help you making this cut, and the kiss block, etc., starts to speed up the process. And again, I would check your fit at this stage against your Grille. As a working method, for me, I like to make a mandrel that is the same size as the Grille, including all the gaps. And if my distance between the two sides is, so if my distance here between the two sides of the collar at this stage is far in excess of my knees, I'm not talking about a 32nd or a 16th, I'm talking 1/8 of an inch or so, then what I do is I take my, here's how I shrink my too wide collar stock. What I've got the bottom swage for making the collar material. I've got my purpose-built top tool with the piece removed to allow the bead, and I've got my mandrel in place, and I'm just going to give this a whack, and I'm trying to upset the collar material in this area. what's going to happen is I get partial upset, partial bowing of the material. The bow I can deal with later, just like I would deal with shrinking a iron tire on a wooden wheel. It was too big. The important thing for me when I have a mandrel is that the mandrel has a taper to the end. And what that's going to do for me, the taper is as long as the collar material is wide. And of course, when that taper is resting underneath the collar will just fall off the end of the mandrel. If you don't have a taper, when you're trying to get rid of or shed the collar from the mandrel, you're going to have to go hunting around the workshop for something to knock this on the end to knock the collar off. These are the blocks on my excuse me, on my jig. You can notice I've got a little bit of room there for clearance for my bead all the way around. And then the height of these, the height has to accommodate room for your set hammer or your hide mallet to come in and make the final bends. And then if you're going to use the forged collar, as I'm showing here to make this little flat across the corners, then you can see that I've got some chatter marks here from some tooling, this tooling in fact. So these blocks need to be cut down to accommodate this tool for this move. Using either your mandrel or the Grille, and I prefer the mandrel, we're going to bend these final two pieces over. Let's have a look at this piece here first. Can you see this corner, You can see I've relieved it just slightly with a file. That's going to mean that as I bend this over, that corner is not going to stick out and hit this bead or the collaring material. It should slip by. So that's important for me. Don't overcook that, just make a little mark, but it's handy to have around. The other thing that's important for me is at this stage when I'm fitting the collar to the Grille, this jig and therefore the Grille is closed up in the vise and is very stable. If you're working on your own, and I'm going to presume you are, this is a very powerful move. You're coming in here with a blow that's going to bend what is basically 5/16 of an inch thick bar, inch wide. And if this is not stable somehow, you're going to send the whole assembly to the floor. And I don't know what sort of language that's going to conjure up in my shop or your shop, but in my shop it's not going to be pretty. With my purpose-built set hammer, I can come along here, I can just pop that on, just lift up the corner a little bit because I've got soft corners, remember, and I can just scooch this material out and I can close this top portion of the collar. I'm not going to be able to get to the root, but that's okay. I can just close this top portion of the collar so it's visually a little more attractive. So now let's have a look at the pinned collar. I don't make many of these things, so I prefer a forged collar, but they do certainly have their place and they have precedence. So this has been used for a long time, and I'm going to show that by looking at some distinguished 17th century work by Jean Tijoux, and this comes from Hampton Court Palace in London. This is a public domain photograph of Tijoux's work at Hampton Court Palace, and I lifted this from Wikipedia. And I want to look at some of these collars on the Grille, specifically those two. I want you to look at this center collar here, and you'll notice these 4 rivets. So it's obviously pinned to something. Let's have a look at this end rivet because that's important for me. You will notice that it is not in line with that style bar. So this rivet must come from the other side of the collaring stock here, the side material. And that's important. So the collar material is pinned to the collar material. These may be pinning it to the frame here, but this is definitely collar to collar. That's shown more accurately here. Again, you can see that the rivet head from the tenon is off to the side. It's obviously not passing through this scroll material. So it's collar material pinned to collar material. This is somebody dealing with some rust jacking of the scroll work here on the Tijoux screen, just carving out the rust and then filling it with paint. Firstly, let's look at the things that didn't work with my pin collar. And with my thin bead here, having a centered tenon isn't going to work. You can see here that the centered tenon, the mortise for the centered tenon, has blown out the edge of the bead and it's just not going to finish well. So I'm obliged to do 2 tenons on the back strap material. Again, this is focusing on what not to do. You can see that my mortise is very close to the end of my collar stock there, and when I'm riveting I run the risk, certainly with this back one here, of blowing out this material when I rivet the tenon over. So that's what not to do. As I've shown here, I've got my, this is what not to do, I've got my tenon centered on the backstrap material. What does that do for me? Well, certainly it's very centered. I've got a shoulder here on the back and I've got a shoulder here on the front. Don't forget that other bit of collar material, the bit that's going to go here with the mortise in it. This is why I had that very thin mortise wall. So I don't need this shoulder at the back. So let's get rid of this. Let's move this tenon across to the back so that the back side of the tenon is in line with the back of the back strap of the collar, and that's going to give me a much heavier shoulder here, which is going to move my drill hole for the mortise further inboard of the collaring stock. One of the first things I do is I file the collaring stock, and I'm going to file the back strap because you can get some slight twists in there. You've got some hammer lumps and bumps, and I want to be able to put some layout fluid over there. I use Dychem, which is a layout solution, but you could just use a broad Sharpie, just something that's going to be able to hold a scratch hole line so that you can see it. You're going to need an engineer's square, and you're going to need a decent scribe. Here's me making my appropriate now. You can see that my tenon is in line with the back strap here, and I've got a much better shoulder on the front. So I typically cut out the bead, then I cut out either side, drill out the center. I've got square, eventually take the octagon, and then round. You'll notice from this photograph that the joints of this style of collar are placed on the side pieces, keeping the viewing surfaces at the front and the back clean. The front and the back material therefore has to be cut overly long to accommodate for the extra material that you're going to need in here. I have 1 3/4 inches, I said, for my material to be collared. The back strap is 1/4 inch, the bead is 1/4 inch total from back of the back strap, top of the bead, 1/2 inch, so I need 1 3/4 inches plus 1/2 inch plus 1/2 inch. That's a little tight for me to feel comfortable, so I add another 1/8 inch, and now I can go to work. The way I'm dealing with my getting 2 tenons is I cut down with a hacksaw and then cut in, get rid of that piece of material, cut down, cut in, get rid of that, and then I cut down twice here. Why twice? Because that allows me room when I make this drill movement here, that if I am a little close to the edge, that even if I blow out the side with the drill, it's not going to ding my tenon material. If I'm a little tight, if I don't have space in here, then if I blow out, I can sometimes carve into the tenon material, and that's going to make me cry. For the single tenon, if you've got a much wider bead, then it's the same sort of thing. You're just going to cut to get rid of the bead, then cut the edges out, and that's going to leave you with this chunk of material. You're going to file that chunk to a square section. Here we go, we're filing to a square section, and then eventually, obviously, you're just going to take that to as big a round as you can possibly get. Once you've got one side fitted, then I'm going to offer up the work that I've done to the grill, and I'm going to scribe a line here. Remember, that's going to be a curved line, so you're going to deal with this mark and this mark, and now you can start to look at putting the mortises in for the second side. Again, what's important to note for me, 2 things. There's the scribe line that I've got, and then I've come ahead of that, half the thickness of that, or the radius of my tenon, put in my center punch marks, and they're about in the right place. More important is I've letter stamped each end corresponding with here, because these are individually cut tenons. This is going to be an end made to fit these cut tenons, so this whole thing is individual. Let's identify it. It's going to take a lot of the frustration out. Here's my collar with me checking the fit of the tenons. I can always come round and file these top surfaces later if one stands proud of the other, and they do. Once you've got the front or the rear piece drilled to accept the tenon, you're going to mark the perimeter, and then you're going to cut away all the excess material here, and then it's just file work. And file work for me, you notice I'm holding this, so I'm supporting this. The vise is biting here and here, same on the other side. It's a little more stable than just clamping on the bead. And so I'm coming in and I'm making the side pieces flush, and then I'm going to make my radius. Notice that I've got a save edge file. That's important for me, so I'm not removing material that I don't want to. Once I've done that, I'm nipping this up just under the tenons here in the vise, and now I'm making the top and the bottom surfaces flush. Once you've got all your filing done and the front and the rear pieces matched, then it's time to take everything that you've filed to the fire. Just bring it up to a scaling heat and turn those nice shiny surfaces to a black heat so everything matches. And then you're ready to rivet up the collar. I am going to put a little bit of JB weld under here just to keep everything snug so it's not a loose fit. If you have a tight fit, and tight fit can't be much because you've scribed everything, so you can come in, because this scroll is curved, you've got a pillow of air underneath here. So all you have to do is file the very corners here, which is not going to affect the integrity of your tenon, and you can get a nice fit. So again, just getting rid of those corners are going to help you if you've got overly tight. That's going to conclude this coaching session. If you want to have a look at a forged collar, then click the link that should be coming up nowish. Otherwise, then I've finished with the pinned collar. I'm wishing you good luck with your grill, and I'll see you on the next coaching session.